So I found this neat little car. It's an old Camaro. Right next to this Chevy HHR, which is what I'm actually pulling parts off of. The alternator on my 2008 Pontiac Torrent broke, and it was putting out spikes of voltages that were way higher than the alternator should normally put out. Normally, an alternator should produce 13 to 14 volts. However, what I was finding was that my alternator was routinely putting out 16 volts, and it was spiking all the way up to 18 point something volts. That high voltage obviously messed with a lot of the computer systems in the car, and the power steering module was particularly affected. So I figured that the high voltage had fried the power steering module. I decided to just go ahead and go to a junkyard and get a new power steering module. Well, I fixed the alternator and the power steering just started working again. So I went to a junkyard and got a power steering module. I actually got the entire steering column because that was just easier. And then it turns out that I didn't actually need it. Now, I've got a Pontiac Torrent. That's somewhat of a rare car. It definitely wasn't their best seller in 2008. Pontiac itself wasn't really their strongest brand, and that's why they chose to get rid of it. But the great thing about owning a vehicle made by a larger company, General Motors, is the parts bin. Now, a lot of companies do this, but the American companies have this down to a science. They will design a part for one car, and then they will reuse that same part in several different cars. So sometimes they take the whole car and slap a different badge on it. That's called badge engineering. And examples of this, the Plymouth Breeze is the exact same car as a Dodge Neon, just with a different grille. Same with the Chrysler Cirrus and the Dodge Stratus. However, sometimes they just reuse parts. Interior parts are the easiest to see, but it happens under the hood as well. The window switches on this Dodge Dakota are the same window switches that you see in the Plymouth Breeze. Lots of interior parts on this Plymouth Breeze you can see are reused in cars like this Chrysler Cirrus. The gauge cluster, steering wheel, vents, radio, climate controls, all are common between the Chrysler Cirrus and the Plymouth Breeze. And you'll see that the Chrysler Cirrus shares its shift knob with the Chrysler Prowler, and all the vehicles have the same radio as this Dodge Caravan. In fact, radio and climate controls are shared so often that Chevy used the same radio in just about all their vehicles for about a decade. Everything from the Chevy Cobalt to the Chevy Silverado. Now, the Pontiac Torrent is very rare, but it's really just a rebadged Chevy Equinox. It is the exact same car as the Chevy Equinox, and all the internal components are exactly the same. The only difference is the front grille and the emblem on the steering wheel. So I expected that I would be able to get the power steering module off of a Chevy Equinox. However, this junkyard didn't have any Chevy Equinoxes, which I thought was kind of strange. But what they did have was a lot of Chevy HHRs. You know what I don't get? The Chevy HHR. So the Chevy SSR was like a little pickup. It was supposed to be, bringing back the retro styling in an El Camino type platform. And it didn't sell. And actually, Chevy SSRs are now worth a ton of money because they are so rare. But anyway, it was a total flop. But then they take the same platform, that same kind of retro style design, they make it into a wagon, which at the time in the early 2000s, the wagon had been on the decline for many, many years as SUVs were starting to take over. But now they decided to make it into a wagon, and suddenly they sold a ton of them, and I mean a ton of them. And now they're absolutely worthless. You'll find these cars abandoned on the side of the road. The people just abandon them in like old parking lots and on the side of the road, and there's tons of them in junkyards. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these Chevy HHRs in this junkyard. There's one right here, there's one right there, and there's a bunch more. There's actually more Chevy HHRs in this junkyard than there are Chevy Equinoxes, which seems wild to me. But anyway, I always kind of wonder who bought these. Now, don't get me wrong, I love wagons and hatchbacks and, you know, smaller hatchbacks, wagon type things. But what is the deal with these? They looked it up on their computer, and it said that the power steering module was the same for the Chevy HHR as my Pontiac Torrent. So I went out and looked at all of them and found the one that was going to be the best. I also decided to take the entire steering column because it would be easier just to swap out the entire steering column rather than the individual components. Also, I've got some other problems with my steering column. My park lockout switch isn't working properly, so the key gets stuck in the ignition, and the turn signal stock, number one, it's about to break off. Number two, it doesn't automatically turn off. And so those issues could all be solved if I just swapped the entire steering column. But before I could do that, I had to find a steering column that would be a good match. Right off the bat, I found several HHRs that had either the airbags deployed or the airbags removed. Then I found a really nice leather-wrapped steering wheel that looked to be in really great shape. However, the car was full of mold. Now, when it comes to mold, if you have a surface that is non-porous and easy to bleach, think like vinyl, metal, plastic, that surface is very easy to disinfect and the mold does not sink into the material. However, when it comes to leather, and especially the foam that is inside the interior of a lot of vehicles now, the mold just gets into that and it seeps down in, and you have a really hard time getting rid of it. So if there is a lot of mold, if the interior smells like mold, or normally they put a giant warning sticker on there saying that there's mold, I would just stay away from it unless it is something that you can very easily clean and disinfect. Then I found another vehicle where the steering wheel, the outer coating of the wheel, was starting to wear off. This is another HHR, and the steering wheel, the outer coating on it is starting to wear off. So the steering wheel's kind of sticky in some parts, and then in some parts you can actually feel the foam start crumbling and it gets on your fingers and it's ugh. So yeah, no, that's not a good steering wheel. So I finally found the steering column that I wanted in an old panel van version of the HHR. And so I proceeded to remove it. Now, I will apologize in advance. I didn't really show all of the steps. Basically, I was just trying to record on my phone while I was taking out this steering column. However, the steering column was surprisingly easy. Once I got the panels off, the interior panels, it was just a few bolts to drop down the entire steering column and then a bolt to remove it from the steering shaft that goes down to the wheels. And the power steering module, the electronic power steering motor, and the entire steering column just came right out. It was super easy. And we're trying to get to the power steering, which is way down in there. So there are 2 bolts that were on that panel that I just took off. But anyway, now we need to take this off. It's like 4 bolts, and then we should be able to get to what we're actually working on. That is the computer module we're after right here. It is the power steering control module. And then we're also going to take this pump here, GM parts bin, don't fail me now. Oh, and I'm also taking these clips. These clips are really annoying because they break off really easily, so whenever you are at a junkyard and you take off something that uses these clips, go ahead and grab them. Okay, so I figured out that by just removing this bolt right back here and the one on the other side right there, the steering column can just drop down. I also had to remove one bolt that held this little thing in place right here, and now this entire thing is ready to come out as soon as I remove some wires from the entire steering column and the power steering system. And I figure the easiest way to do that in a junkyard, I'll do it in an expedited manner. And this will help me when I go to install this, because I'll be able to tell which wire goes where. And if I find that some of the connectors are broken, I'll have the connectors right there that I can reuse. Oops. Okay, I think this thing is ready to come out. Okay, so I lied. There's actually one more bolt in there. You can see the end of it right here, and it's a really long bolt that comes from here. So I just need to take that bolt out, and then this entire thing will drop free. Right now it's holding on by that one bolt. So there's one more set of wires to cut. So this bundle, it goes up somewhere up into the dash, and then it also comes down here to the throttle position sensor. And looks like this is the brake position sensor as well. So it's just a more part of the traction control systems, but it's something we don't need to track down. And there we go. So I got the steering column back here, and I got the new alternator, I installed it, and then the power steering starts working. Apparently there's a circuit breaker inside the power steering module, and when it senses that high voltage, it shuts down the module so that no damage can happen. So as soon as the voltage was returned back to normal with the new alternator, the power steering started working again, and I didn't have to replace that module. So that's the story of how I ended up with an old Chevy steering column in my garage. But now I'm conflicted whether I want to try to fix those other problems I mentioned with the steering column, using either by swapping the specific parts over from that steering column to my steering column, or by just replacing the entire steering column. Basically, I'm planning on selling this Pontiac and getting something else, but I'm kind of debating whether I want to put in the work to fix those things, and whether it will actually get me a better price when I go to sell this car. I'm not sure whether the time it would take to fix those problems would really translate into any monetary gain when I go to sell this car. Now, if you're thinking about buying a car, let me know if you want a 2008 Pontiac Torrent. If you want to know why I'm getting rid of it, you can watch this video on the left, and if you're interested in buying a car that's not my Pontiac Torrent, you should probably watch this video on the right about how much mileage actually matters when you're buying a used car.